Welcome to Casual Friday. So I think this Casual Friday is going to consist of 3 parts, maybe 4, I'm not sure. So I'll put links down, so if there gets to be some section where I'm complaining about how frustrated I am with spinning, you can jump to the next section. So last week I had finished up a sock project and I didn't have any projects to work on. I needed something new, and I've been so preoccupied with spinning that I haven't even thought about what I'm going to knit. I've only been thinking about, well, what will I knit with the yarn that I'm spinning? Like, what could I reasonably knit with that? And I haven't finished my yarn yet. I've got a lot of singles that I've been working on in my spinning class. We haven't applied them yet. I haven't seen how much I have. So I've got small projects in mind for those. But in the meantime, I just needed something to work on. So my youngest daughter, is home from college all summer long. It's the first time she's been home all summer since she went to college. So it's been really nice having an adult child around who cleans up after herself. She'll go food shopping, she'll cook dinner, she'll cook all kinds, it's fantastic. We have great conversations. When she was home during the winter holidays, she mentioned to me that she thought she should take advantage of the fact that her mother knits and could potentially knit her a sweater that would be exactly what she wanted, because she has quite a few sweaters that she likes, but there's always like one little thing she wishes was different. So I was super busy at the time. I was ready to drop everything just to knit her a sweater. But she wasn't sure exactly what she wanted, and one thing that she was sure of was that she wanted it to be the right sweater and to be something that she would be sure to wear for years, so that I wouldn't go to all that work and then she would wear it, and then the next year she would think, oh, this isn't really in style anymore. So she was concerned about that. At the same time, she's a young, fashionable woman, so she doesn't want something that looks like old-fashioned, but she wants something that's going to look current for a number of years. I just know from being a knitter of 30 years that certain styles can carry you through for years. Like I have a sweater that's 30 years old that once I over-dyed it to get rid of the stains, it's been great. I wore it a lot this winter. But I have a couple other sweaters that I will wear around the house, maybe not so much out in public. And what I tend to do is make a new sweater. I'll wear it a lot the first couple of years, and then it starts, get pills on it, and then I'm knitting something else and I want to wear that one. So I do have quite a few sweaters in rotation now. I usually end up making 1 or 2 sweaters a year. I think that's about how it evens out. Sometimes I end up with no sweaters, but then the next year I finish up several, and then I end up with 3 new sweaters. So I'm not really concerned about that, but she's concerned about it. So we went through Ravelry. We looked at different things. What are you looking for? You're looking for texture. You're looking for cables. You're looking for this. You're looking for that. Do you want a pullover? Do you want kind of neck? So we worked all that out, and she found something that she liked. And so I did some swatching. She liked the swatches. I happen to have the exact color of gray that she wears all the time. It's been sitting in my stash for probably 10 years. Have plenty of it, and but we didn't quite get measurements down before she left, so that swatch just sat there for months. And so last week I thought, oh, I could knit her that sweater. So I said, do you still want that sweater that we talked about? And once again she's like, oh, I just don't know. I want to make sure it's the right thing. I don't know if I want a pullover that's a little looser, or if I want something more tailored. And I said, you can have more than 1 sweater. And she's just really worried that I'm going to go to all that work and then she'll only wear it for a year or maybe 2 years. And I'm not worried about that at all. So her 21st birthday is coming up in about a week and a half. So I said, I said, well, I don't care if you don't want it. I'm knitting it because I need something to knit. So I started working on it last weekend. And front. I have the back done. It's a mock cable pattern, so it's kind of it's simple and yet it's interesting enough. The pattern is and so she's worried about it, you know, not being in fashion or not being wanting to wear it in a couple of years. And I pointed out to her that this sweater was designed by Melissa Leitman, which means nothing to her, but she's been a designer for years. It was a pattern that first appeared in Vogue Knitting, which is, you know, on the fashion end, in 2002, which shows you the staying power of the sweater. The one thing about it that kind of dated it was the length. So the picture of the model is taken with her seated, and so the whole sweater, you can see the bottom of the sweater in the photo. It's not folded over or anything, so you can see it. So I think the sweater, as the pattern is written, is maybe only 17 inches in length, which is pretty short. So I'm like, there's no waist shape. There's nothing, you know, to worry about. Just add extra length to it. So I did measure and see, like, where do you want this to fall on you? And she's like, well, sometimes I'm going to want to wear it out, and sometimes I'm going to want to have the front tucked into my pants. And so, you know, we just figured out, like for me, I usually make my sweaters 24 inches long because I want them to hit a certain place. So for her, we decided 22 inches would probably be the right place. So it may not be 100% what she wants, but it's going to be something that I think she's going to like and that she will wear at least this winter. And my hope is that she's not going to wear it this summer. I'll have it done by the end of the summer. I think I can get it done in a total of 3 weeks, because I do have that 3-week tolerance for working on any particular project before I have to put it to the side. But this is a gift, which means I have a specific reason for wanting to get it done. So if I can't, I've got myself a spreadsheet. I use spreadsheets for my knitting in a lot of different ways. And one of them is to keep track of how much I've gotten done in any particular day. So for any project, I will immediately create a Ravelry project page right when I start, and I'll create a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet calculates the stitch counts row by row. I mean, I'll do groups of rows if they're all the same number of stitches for however many rows. Keep a running total of what the stitch count is. You know, keep track of how many stitches on a row when they're shaping. I'll go through the entire pattern, create the spreadsheet that has, you know, basically row by row stitch counts, so I get a total stitch count, and then at any particular point in the project, I can tell exactly how far along I am, because I do like to keep track of, you know, my 5%, 10%, 15%, and when there's shaping and it's multiple pieces, I find it difficult to get an accurate guess as to how far. So sometimes just the percentage, I like to know, oh, I'm 90% there. Okay, I'll just keep going. And or if it's a big project, then I can kind of see at what point I'm probably going to be putting it to the side. Another thing that I will do for these stitch counts, when it's multiple balls of yarn, I keep track of when I have ended the first ball of yarn. I can confirm that I am going to have enough for the project. So if it's a big project like a blanket, I'll work the first ball or two and see if I'm going to have enough, and then I can go and get more right away in the same dye lot without any issue. I do this for socks too, where I do the total stitch count. I calculate for whatever kind of heel I'm going to do. It's not so important for me because I don't use more than about 75% of a 100-gram ball of sock yarn in order to make myself a pair of socks. But when I knit for men, sometimes there is a real question about whether 100 grams is enough at all, or if it's enough to make the two socks match, or if it'll be enough to make them match, as long as, like, if I do peasant heels, then I can just use whatever yarn from the end of the ball to do the heels, and it doesn't matter if the heels match each other as long as the rest of the striping sequence matches. So I have a lot of ways that I use this, use these spreadsheets, but I do always create a Ravelry project page right when I start the project. I know some people some people don't do that. They wait until they're done with the project and then they put it in, and because all they're doing is the pattern, the yarn, and maybe a photo, because they're just keeping a record that way. But because I have this 3-week tolerance for working on projects, and because I make a lot of socks or things that come in twos, like mittens or gloves or things like that, often I will make one of the two and then do, like for socks, I'll do one sock and then I'll do the first sock of a different pair, because I'm just playing with the yarns, especially in the summertime when I'm not going to be wearing them. And then the fall comes around and I make the second one. Well, I need to know what needle size I used, and it's helpful if I don't have to count stitches or rows, or to try to figure out what I did in the first sock. So I just keep track of it as I go, because I do know I have a tendency to put things to the side. And even though I write things down on notes all the time, I'm always losing those notes. So I can't rely on myself to record notes for a project in a specific notebook and keep it in. That's not going to happen for me. My strategy is a spreadsheet, and then Ravelry project notes as I go, and then everything works great. So I think, since I have the total number of stitches for this sweater, I divided it by 21 days to see how many stitches per day I'd need to knit, and I think it's doable. Some days I'll probably do a little less, but on the weekends I can do a lot more. So that's my plan. So I'm hoping that this sweater will be done by the end of the month. And then by then I'll know how to ply my spun yarn, and I can start knitting projects from my yarn that I've been making in my spinning class. I need to I should look up to see who those, I think there was 3, it may have been 4, but I'm sure there were at least 3 people who recommended this book to me. It's by Alden Amos. Oh, there's glare. Alden Amos is The Big Book of Hand Spinning. And it is a big book. I think it's about 500 pages, 450 pages, something like that. You guys have been so great about recommending different books to me at different times when I'm like, well, first I want to just try different breeds of wool. Then I'm going to learn to spin. Okay, now I really need to know how things work. So you guys have been really good about recommending books to me. Some of which I've checked out from the Textile Center, and this one I bought. They don't have it at the Textile Center library for some reason. But this is exactly the kind of nerdy, geeky, in-depth, over-the-top amount of information that perfectly suits me. It answers questions that I have had. It lays out in great detail how things work and why it works. The various variations on how something could be done, all the equipment, how it works, and the progression of the evolution of different pieces of spinning tools. And so what I do is, okay, this is a topic I'm interested in. Okay, I get this. Okay, this is going to be interesting to me when I know a little bit more. And then, okay, we've gone over my head, which is great, because that means I'm going to be able to go back to this book over and over and over again. One of the things that's frustrating me right now is ambiguity of terms. We have this in knitting, but I know so much about knitting that I know when a term is ambiguous, and then I know what the possibilities are. And if someone is using a term ambiguously, I know enough to ask for clarification, or I could figure out from the context in which it's used what they mean. But with spinning, I don't. And a lot of times I'm not quite aware of the ambiguity. It's like I have, so here's an example. Certain wheels are great for spinning fine yarns, but not thick yarns. Or this wheel is really great for spinning thick yarns. Well, nobody has defined what they mean by yarn when they're saying that. My assumption has been that they were, well, I don't even know at this point what my assumption was. The yarns that I knit with tend to be multiple plies, 3 plies or 4 plies typically, often 4 plies. The sock yarn that I tend to knit with, fingering weight sock yarn, tends to have 4 plies. The worsted weight yarns I tend to knit my sweaters with tend to have 4 plies. Sometimes they have 3. It just depends on the brand. But they're always plied. I can maybe count on one hand the number of times I've used a 2-ply yarn. Like, I just don't use those kinds of yarns. And I think probably because what I use is a very plain standard yarn in which I'm going to knit textured items, or for socks, you know, it's going to just be plain stockinette, but it's got really firm, firmly spun yarn that is going to wear really well. So these are the kinds of yarns I knit with. And so that my assumption has been, well, that's going to be the kind of yarn I'm going to want to make. I don't know that I would ever make a fingering weight yarn because I don't know that I can or would want to spin plies that were so thin that I would then ply 3 of them together for a sec. But I don't know that yet. But I do know that for sweaters, I'm probably going to want a 3-ply worsted weight yarn. And so that means the plies that I need to create are going to be fairly thin. But my experiment with spindle spinning was that I had plies that I thought were, you know, reasonably thin, but then when I plied them together and I washed it, it got super poofy. And at this point, I don't know if my singles were underplied, if when I plied together was underplied. I've just read something, well, this Alden Amos guy says that the spinning wheel is great for plying. Not the spindle, not so much. So that could be, this result could be a reflection of having plied too loosely and on the spindle. I don't know yet. So I was asking at my spinning class the other day, I said, what do they mean? Like, if they say it's good for fine yarns, what does that mean? Are they talking about the ply? Or they, what does that mean? And she didn't give me a direct, she was responding to my question, but she didn't really answer it. And when people respond to my question without answering, sometimes it takes me a while to realize they didn't really answer my question. But somebody else in the class said, oh, well, thick yarns would be art yarns. I'm like, well, I know that I don't want to knit that. Well, why don't they say that? Like, why? Like, we have this huge range of yarns that we work with as hand knitters, lace weight up to super bulky. So why isn't anybody defining what they mean by that? Are they talking about the individual plies? Or, that's just, it's so ambiguous. I don't know. So the other thing is I've been using this Louette wheel, which I keep reading is great for beginners. But again, that's another ambiguous term that has not been defined adequately for me. Like, what does somebody mean by beginner? Do they mean like a person who's sitting down for the very first time and trying to learn how to draft, the combed or carded wool for the first time in order to make, have the spinning wheel, twist it and pull it in? Is that a beginner? Or is a beginner somebody who's been spinning for, the first year or the first month, or some number of hours of spinning, or certain level of expert? Like, what does that mean, a beginner? I'm used to this Louette now. I don't really care for it. And the more I'm reading about it, these Irish tension, or Alden Amos calls this a German tension system, where it's bobbin led. So the bobbin is the thing that you're turning as you're treadling. You're forcing the bobbin to turn, and the flyer is coming around, rotating with it as you're putting twist into your wool. And then when you actually let this new twisted yarn feed in and wind on, then the flyer breaks. The flyer slows down so that the bobbin can actually wind it up. Where the Scotch tension is the opposite. When you're treadling, the big wheel is driving the flyer, and when the yarn is winding on, the bobbin slows down. So there's these two different tension systems. And I was reading about it this morning. He was explaining it, and it was like over my head, but I understood some of it. He was talking about how you can't do fine yarns on this Irish tension. So I think I've gotten about as thin as I can get with my plies on this spinning wheel. And I know it's not something I want. So I'm going to want to get something with Scotch tension and or that's a double drive. Maybe one that can do both. So I did try a different wheel in my class on Wednesday, and that one was a Lendrum. And it's one that can fold up and travel and fit in a suitcase if you need it to. And it was different because this Louette like really wants to pull the yarn in, and that's one reason why it's better for thicker yarns and probably for like very beginners. Like I would say, once you've had an hour or two of practice, it seems like you should be beyond that. It pulls in so fast that you don't really have time to try to make something, and it's before you can get any twist in, it's just going to break if you're doing it too thin. But anyway, so I kind of have an idea of what I want. I tried the Lendrum. I'm like, the first 5 minutes was like, first of all, it was a double treadle, and this one I've been using is single, and it just doesn't pull in. Like I actually had to adjust things to make it the yarn pull in for quicker, and had to do that a couple of times. So, but I was like, okay, first of all, this is so much easier to make something thinner. I'm going to do that. So I have to return, my last class is this coming Wednesday. And so I'll have to return this wheel, and I'm certainly not going to rent it again. The only other ones that they rent out at the textile center are Ashford Traditionals. And I don't want a wheel like that. It's just too big for the space I have here and to be able to get it out of the way. And you can use the wheels at the textile center. Like I can go there and I could try like 4 or 5 different wheels and try them out, but I can't take them home with me. So I'm going to do that. But so I looked up, the teacher recommended this woman who, Detta's Spindles, it's called. It's like an hour drive from where I live. But she's got like not every kind, but she has more variety of spinning wheels that she sells, and apparently has them in her showroom, than I've seen from anybody else locally. Like there's a yarn shop that sells Ashford. A Weavers Guild sells Shacked, because Shacked does looms and spinning wheels. There's another place that has a couple of different ones that they do, but this Detta's Spindles, she's probably got 5 or 6 different brands that she sells. So I'm going to go up there. I'm going to email her and ask her if I can come up tomorrow and try a bunch out, and then see what I think of the different wheels, because I know I'm going to want one, and I'm going to want to have one at home to use, and I'm not going to want to keep using the Louette, so I'm going to need to get one, I think, sooner rather than later. So I think one of the things that's frustrating me, another thing that's frustrating me is, you know, she told us in that first week, make sure you just spend 5 minutes every day and make sure you're building muscle memory. I think that setting a minimum like that means it's, easy to at least sit down and do something for 5 minutes, and hopefully you'll sit down longer. So I think I was spinning for a minimum of 30 minutes a day, and there was one day where I was probably good 2 to 3 hours I was spinning. So I'm getting a lot of spinning practice in, and the thing that's frustrating me now is I don't know. I want to just learn it in the class. Is how to do the plying, how to figure out the thing. There's a whole lot of technical stuff that's going on, like calculating the twists per inch and how it's going to ply, and then setting the ply and doing all of this kind of stuff. So I'm accumulating all of these singles that I haven't been able to do anything with, and I kind of feel like I want to know the results of that, so then I can say, okay, but here's what my goal is. So I need to learn to do this, or I need to learn to do that, like put more twist into it, or make it thinner, or do something, so that I have a goal. But I can't do that yet because I don't know the stage. We're going to do that next week, is the plying. What we did the other night was super fun. We learned to use the drum carder. So we took a little bit of wool that's maybe, this big, and we picked it. So we're going to separating the fibers a little bit. And we learned how to use a drum carder and ran it through twice. So this little bit of wool ended up it's almost like a pillow, this huge fluffy pillow. So easy to spin. But then I started having questions about, okay, that's this much wool. Like if I were making a sweater, I'd probably need a pound or more of wool. And if I don't have my own drum card, those things are expensive. If I were taking it all to the textile center and using the drum carder and doing it all, then what do I do about transporting it? Like we didn't learn, we just like made our thing and then we spun it. But I didn't even think about, what if I wanted to do a sweater's worth of wool, I card it, how would I store it or transport it, or it's going to take up like half of this room, and then all the fuzz is going to fly all over. It was like stuck to my pants for all next day. Wore the same pants and I kept finding wool stuck to me. So that's another question I have that I don't know the answer to yet. But carding, I really liked that. I really liked that process. I think I'm going to enjoy preparing my own. Well, I don't know that I'll want to wash my own wool. Never say never. I think I probably want to buy clean wool and then process it, learn to process it. That's what I'm thinking is probably going to happen. Okay, so now this week's history lesson. So I've been reading so much about these guilds, like sort of the modern day guilds, and how women are so involved in these modern day guilds. And I've learned quite a bit about sort of the medieval guilds in the past. I have an ancestor who was a coppersmith in Sweden, and he had a surname, and that the family had a heritable surname for 2 or 3 generations before he was born, which was really unusual in Scandinavia at the time. They used patronymics, which is father's name. So like my last name is Richardson, which means son of Richard. So if my father was Richard and I was George, I'd be George Richardson. But then my kid would be, Sam Georgeson, for example. So it changes every generation. So you are who, and then if you're a woman, you aren't somebody Olsen, you're somebody Oladaughter. So and your name would stay that way. When you're a woman, your surname didn't change because it wasn't a heritable thing. So, you might be Inga Oladaughter, who's married to Jan Svensson, and your name is always Inga Oladaughter. And then your kids have a patronymic that's, Svensson, because your husband is Sven. So so the patronymics were like that, like just forever in Scandinavia. And it wasn't until early 1900s that in the Scandinavian countries, they had to pick a heritable surname, like you had to pick a surname. And so the people before that time who did have a heritable surname, there was a reason why they had one. And typically it was because they were either merchants or they were skilled craftspeople. And once you had that, then you picked a surname, and then your family inherited it. So my great-great-grandfather was Lars Theodor Ekman, and his father was Lars Jacob Ekman, and his father was Lars Ulrich Ekman. And then I haven't been able to find further back than that. So my third great-grandfather was the one who was a coppersmith. So he had to apprentice as a coppersmith, and then he went on his journeyman travels. So he met his wife when he was in Silesia. She was German. It's one of those places that's on the German-Polish border, and it kind of switched control over the centuries. So now it's part of Poland, but at the time she was German, so he met his wife there. There's all these copper mines in that area, which is probably why he was there. They got married, they returned to Sweden. So I learned something about the guilds because of him and how that all worked, and then how the surnames worked and everything. But everything I'd read about guilds, well, and also just knowing what societies were like at that time, was that guilds were for men, not for women. So, but as I've been learning more about spinning, It's just like, you know, a lot of times you'll see, oh, weavers were men, but then when it was at home or if it was in the United States, like whole families would do weaving or something. But it seems like regardless of the culture or time period, spinning was something that was done by women. So that made me think, well, if they had these guilds for knitters, these male knitters, and they had guilds for weavers, and both of these groups relied on women spinners to supply them with yarn, were there guilds for spinners? And I think there was, from what I'm reading. And there were some guilds that women were allowed in guilds in certain circumstances. And it's interesting to me that, you know, an apprentice, you know, they think of these apprentices as male, like if you want to apprentice and become a skilled craftsman in some area, you had to be a boy. But that didn't mean, and then in order to sell the goods, you had to be a journeyman or a master. So the whole idea of the guilds was sort of like a trade union in a way. It was to control, it was quality control and price control, I think, so that somebody who wouldn't be practicing the craft that you had really studied under, they weren't like building shoddy work and undercutting your prices. So it was a way to really protect their trade. But that didn't mean that other people couldn't learn to do those things, especially if they were doing them for themselves, like knitting, like the knitting guilds that were men. They were doing really fine, exquisite work that would be probably sold to wealthy people. But that didn't mean that somebody at home who was doing all of this spinning anyway couldn't also learn to knit. It only takes a couple of sticks, so they might be knitting on coarser wool yarns or just making things for themselves. They weren't trying to sell it, which it sounds like it's okay. And that's when knitting began to get transferred to women, when it was like the knitting guild wasn't a thing so much anymore. Then you'd see whole families, you know, the little kids were, you know, knitting the leg of the sock, and then the big sister would turn the heel, and, you know, so that you'd start kids on socks, and you're knitting for yourself or you're knitting for people locally, but you're not selling at that high level. But anyway, I was looking at spinning and women in guilds. And so one of the things that it looks like was possible, so if a master craftsman died, his wife was allowed to continue running the business. So it's not clear to me if that means she had been taught how to do these things, or if she was allowed to run the business by hiring journeymen or whoever to do the work. I'm not clear on that, but I think the spinners did have guilds. That to me is so fascinating, because without the spinners, I mean, it's become very clear to me how important yarn is to humanity, like for tens of thousands of years, how important yarn is, because the most important things in survival is food, clothing, and shelter. And food, you know, it's really helpful for capturing animals, for example. If you have ropes or if you have nets or things like that, and what are you going to make those out of? Well, you're going to need some yarn of some sort, some kind of fiber that you're twisting, and you're going to make ropes and fishing lines out of that. For clothing, yes, you can sew, you know, animal hides together and make yourself a coat, but to actually create other kinds of clothing or bedding or curtains or rugs, you know, vessels for holding things in, you need to do weaving. And so again, like baskets you could weave without yarn, but all of your clothing, you're going to need yarn that you can then weave into something. Not only that, but if you want to go anywhere by ocean and you don't want to paddle your way across, you need a sail to help you go faster. Somebody has to spin the yarn before they can weave that yarn into a sail. And so since the spinning was done on a spindle for so long, that's like really labor intensive. So people didn't have that many clothes, and they weren't doing that much sailing. So then in the Middle Ages, when these guilds started to appear, there's a whole bunch of things that happened in this like couple 100-year period that is all interconnected, and I think is amazing. So one of the things that happened was they figured out how to attach a spindle onto what they could, there's a couple different names for them, but a great wheel. So there's this giant wheel, and they just mounted, let me see if I, so let's say this is the spindle. So they figured out a way to mount this horizontally, and so that a wheel that you just turn by hand could rotate this really fast, and you know, so you just, you know, give the wheel a shove, and then you could spin a certain amount of yarn in a certain way. It's a certain type of yarn called woolen spun. You couldn't do the worsted spun on one of these. But this really speeded up production, this great wheel. And it wasn't until they figured out this flyer and bobbin system with the treadles that they could really speed up the production. But once they sped up production of spinning, because it took 5 to 10 spinners to supply one weaver with their yarn, they could spin up, they could increase the production of yarn, then they could increase the amount of cloth that they were producing, which meant there was more available to use for clothing, because clothing would get used, then it would get recut into clothing for, you know, smaller, for children or smaller people. So things would get reused and reused. There weren't that many rags left over. So when you can create more cloth, then you end up with ultimately with more rags, and you also are able to make more sales, and it makes long journey trade routes more feasible, not to mention world exploration by ship. So that was a profound change. This treadle spinning wheel, from the spindle to the driven spindle, which is the great wheel, and to the treadle powered spinning wheels, huge, made a huge difference, because when you have more cloth and then you have more rags, then you can make cheap paper, which the printing press can print onto rather than having to create parchment out of animal skin. You can create cheap paper, you can print it on it with movable type, that Gutenberg press, and then more people can become educated. It's just this amazing, you know, one thing after another, that, and how important spinning is to all of that. So I never appreciated it. I never really thought about how important a strand of yarn is to the function of human society. So it's not surprising that the Industrial Revolution began with textiles, by speeding up the production of textiles in the mills. So they figured out how to mechanize weaving, but they still hadn't quite figured out how to mechanize spinning to a point where it could be done by machine rather than individual people. So that took a little long. That kind of lagged behind. They had to do that. Once they figured out a faster way to weave, they had to figure out a faster way to spin, and they did eventually do that. So I'm still looking into the whole arts and crafts movement, and now I'm fascinated by spinners guilds, if there really were such a thing or not. I'm still trying to locate information. I think it's one of those things where I'm gonna have to find a book, because websites give very, you know, you think a website has an unending amount of space to provide information, but they tend to provide the least amount, because I think people who are Googling like I am, they, you know, make a hit here, make a hit there, and they're just skimming the internet. They're not really reading in depth. So I think I'm gonna have to find a book on this. So that's it for this week. Hopefully next week I'll be able to show you some of my finished plied yarn, and that I'll be able to start a project with that yarn. We'll see. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.